Hello and welcome. We are glad you have joined us. My name is Marco Estrada, and I'm a Microsoft technical trainer specializing in Microsoft Azure infrastructure and security. I'm here to walk you through the AZ-700 course, Design and Implement Microsoft Azure Network Solutions. In this session, we'll cover Design and Implement Private Access to Azure Services. In this video, we're going to learn how to lock down pass access using virtual network service endpoints and Azure Private Link with private endpoints. You will also learn configuration concepts and then apply them in hands-on exercises. Let's get started. In this section, we're going to talk about design and implement service endpoints. We're going to learn what they are and also how we can implement policies within service endpoints. A service endpoint is a direct connection from your virtual network to supported Azure services, like Entra ID, maybe storage, or even a SQL server. So the idea is that you can restrict the flow of traffic and enable your virtual machines to access that specific service directly from your private Azure space. The traffic always stays on the Microsoft Azure backbone network. Service endpoint policies will provide you with more granular access control from your virtual network to your Azure storage account. In this case, access to all other resources for that specific service will be denied, so giving you explicit allow policy. The idea behind it is to move beyond the just service level access to a more specific resource level access. Now, let's take a look on how we can enable service endpoint in a specific subnet. Then later, we're going to allow network access to a specific storage account from one of the subnets that we have. We are going to confirm that we can access to that specific service using the service endpoint. And then we're also going to confirm that we cannot access that specific storage account from other subnet or from the internet. In this demo, we're going to enable a service endpoint within a subnet. First, we need to take a look at the virtual network that we want to do that. In this case, we have different virtual networks that we have created. I'm going to select the VNet hub, and within that, we're going to select the subnet for my virtual machine 0, which is the default subnet. If I scroll down under configurations that I have here, I'm going to see that, well, the network security group that is associated to it that we saw on a previous demo, and we have an option to enable service endpoints. Right now, we don't have any service endpoints enabled. We have multiple services in Azure here that we can enable the service endpoint from. In our case, we're going to add a storage service endpoint because that's what we're going to test in a moment. Let's save that configuration, and while we wait for this to apply, one other thing that we need to do in a bit, it is going to review the storage account. Let's take a look at the different storage accounts that we have here. I have one created for this specific purpose called Saba Blobs. And in here, we have a specific blob container for images. I have only one image here that is a Ninja cat over a T-Rex. I'm going to copy that URL and I'm going to paste it into the browser. You can see that this image can be opened from my machine. I'm also going to open it from different other virtual machines. This is virtual machine 0. Do you remember that? That's the one that we created in the hub network. And also we have virtual machine 1 that is located in the spoke network. So far, so good. Everybody is using the public IP and their own public IPs to access this image. But now we're going to finish the configuration for the service endpoint because it is not only the enablement on the subnet that needs to be done. We need also to configure the storage account within the network settings. We're using a storage account here, but this networking configuration will work for most of PaaS services or platform as a service. You have the public access enabled, which you can access from any network, which is the case in our environment. What we're going to do is that we're going to change that, because instead of having access from all networks, we're just going to select a specific subnet in this case. The moment I select Enable from Selected Network, I have this option to add virtual networks. We already have the hub network that we are going to use because we enabled that for that purpose. And in here, we have the different subnets that we have on that specific virtual network. As you can see, the default doesn't need a service endpoint because we already did it just a moment ago. The only thing that is needed then is just selecting the virtual network itself. So I'm going to add that only to that specific virtual network. What is going to happen is that any access from anybody from anywhere will be blocked. That is part of the goal of the usage of service endpoints once the settings are being saved. We probably need to take a minute or so to make the configuration change. Let's take a look at my virtual machine, or the machine that I'm connecting from now, and the moment that I click refresh the page, I have an authorization failure because I don't have access to it anymore. I can also take a look at virtual machine 1. If I try to refresh that, the same thing happens because the virtual network subnet hasn't been added to the service endpoint or the configuration for the storage account. Whereas my virtual machine 0, which is the one that we have on the default subnet, still has access to it. Remember, we are still accessing the public endpoint in here. What I mean is that if I do an NS lookup using that specific FQDN, we're still going to get the public IP from that specific storage account. The only thing that we're changing here is that we're using the private IP from any machine that is on the default subnet to get access to that public IP for the storage account. In a sense, we're blocking anything else that is not defined in there. We're just changing the routing to get to that storage account. And with that, let's go back to the presentation. In this section, we're going to talk about how to design and implement Azure Private Link service and Azure Private Endpoint. We're going to start knowing about what is Azure Private Link. Then later, we're going to talk about private endpoints, how it's going to work with DNS integration, and then later, we're going to talk about the Azure Private Link service. In the previous section, we learned that we can use service endpoint to connect to our Azure resources, but we still were using the public IP addresses for that specific Azure resource. Private Link will help us access these services privately on the Azure platform. So we're going to learn 2 ways to use Private Link. If you want to privately connect to a PaaS service, we're going to create a private endpoint. If you want to privately render a service behind a standard load balancer, we are going to create a private link service. And remember, all data travels on the Microsoft backbone network. When we are creating a private endpoint and then associated to a public Azure service, what we're basically doing is we're making it private. But there are 3 key points that you need to consider with this new architecture. First, the Azure resource becomes, in a sense, part of our virtual network. Then, the connection to the resource now uses the Microsoft Azure backbone instead of the public internet. And last but not least, you can configure that specific Azure resource to no longer expose its public IP address, which eliminates that potential security risk. One thing to consider is that when you're changing the public resolution to a private one, you also need to change how you're going to reach that specific FQDN. So in a sense, you will need to create a private DNS zone, like the one that we saw in a previous video, to make that path service work. So you can either use your virtual network workload with this DNS integration, or maybe you want to use a peer virtual network workload as well. Or maybe you want to use your on-premises networks with a DNS forwarder. And don't forget, we also have Azure Private Resolver for these specific cases. So we can use it for your on-premises workloads, or maybe you want to integrate it with a DNS forwarder, or better yet, we can use the Azure Private Resolver for virtual network and on-premises workloads. Now we are going to disable the public access to a specific Azure resource. Then we're going to create a private endpoint and associate it to that specific resource. And last but not least, we're going to review that the users of our resource have private access from the virtual network. In this demo, we're going to create a private endpoint for the storage account that we have with that image. Here we are at the Private Link overview under the Network Foundation view in the Azure portal. We are going to click Create and we're going to select the course's resource group. In here, we are going to name it Saba Blobs Private Endpoint. Remember, the private endpoints always have a network interface name associated to it, so that's just fine. We are going to select the West Europe region, and next we need to define which resources are we going to use. The connection method is important later because when we talk about private link service, we need to remember what is the alias that we are going to use, but that's something that we're just going to review in a different demo. So that will be just fine. I need to select the resource types. I'm going to search for storage account. I'm going to select my blob storage account and the blob sub resource. Then I need to define where in my environment I want to add this private endpoint so I can put it in a virtual hub or the spoke network in this case. It is up to me where I want to put it. In other words, there is not really a specific restriction around it. I'm going to use the same subnet as my virtual machine 0 and I'm going to associate a dynamic IP address for it. I can do it static if I want to, but nevertheless, dynamic is just fine. One of the important things about private endpoints is the name resolution. Because if you remember, the FQDN of the storage account is a Microsoft public FQDN. We need to do this separate resolution to get the private IP. In this case, we're going to integrate it with the private zone for blobs, and we're just going to create a private endpoint once the deployment is complete. When the deployment is complete, we can take a look at the resource to make sure that everything is working correctly. The connection status is approved. I can also go to specific storage account. And one of the things that, since now I have in a private configuration only, is that I can just disable any public access. What we are doing here is that we're blocking any public access, so everything that is going to go through is the private endpoint. Once I disable the public access and take a look at the private endpoint, I see that everything looks just fine. Let's come back to the virtual machine 0. We're going to refresh the page. Doesn't change really anything, or doesn't seem that anything has changed. Let's review that I'm now using the private IP. The private DNS that was created, the private link.blob.core.windows.net, since it is listening at the Azure DNS provided configuration, it is now resolving my storage account. Now, that hypothetical will give me access from anywhere on the network that has access to that specific IP. In this case, the virtual machine 1 could be the case, but nevertheless, when I refresh the page, I see that I still don't have access to it. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to troubleshoot that, and in order to troubleshoot, the first thing that I need to do, I need to review what is the IP address. Although we see the private link that is associated to the name, I don't have the same IP resolution. I'm still getting the public IP, but remember, we just blocked the public access. The missing piece here is that in the moment that we created the private endpoint, it was the first time that we created the private DNS zone. We still need to do the proper configuration. What I mean by that is that the private.blob.core.windows.net private zone, it is only associated to my virtual network hub. I still need to associate that to my spoke virtual network. Let's name it spoke 1 and then select it as well, and also enable fallback to the internet. This is important if you're using other storage accounts that are not connected privately, so they can still be resolved not by your private DNS zone, but a public request to the DNS. Let's wait a little bit until this configuration goes through. And once the configuration has completed, we can see that the spoke 1 is enabled. What that means is that the virtual machine 1 can now resolve the proper subblobs. And that is correct because now, instead of seeing the 20.150, we're seeing the 10.0.0.5 address, which that means that if I refresh the page, which was not working before, and still not, that's probably related to cache. Let's close the browser and open a new one. And with that, I can just review that I can access now the image privately within my network. Let's go back to our presentation. Azure Private Link service is the reference to your own service that is powered by Azure Private Link. So the idea is that your service that is running behind an Azure standard load balancer can be enabled for this so that your consumers to your service can access it privately from their own VNets. In other words, your consumers can create a private endpoint inside their VNet and map that private endpoint to this private link service. So in a sense, a private link service can receive multiple connections from multiple private endpoints. And a private endpoint connect only to a specific private link service, just like we can connect that specific private endpoint to an Azure storage account or a SQL server. Now let's create a private link service which will be associated to a standard load balancer. Later, we're going to create a private endpoint that is going to be mapped to that specific private link service. And last, we're going to take the users to connect to that specific private endpoint to access your service within the private link service. In this demo, we're going to create a private link service. Here we are at the network foundation, and just below the private endpoint, we have the private link service. In order to create this one, we're going to not only need the configuration that we normally have, like selecting the resource group for courses, but we're also going to publish this private link service from my standard load balancer. That it's going to be my name. I'm going to use West Europe as my region, and I'm going to select my outbound settings. In here, I need to select the load balancer that we created in a previous demo. So the load balancer has a front-end IP address that could be either private or public. And then we need to define where we want to put the source NAT subnet for this specific exercise. In this case, since we created back in another demo the load balancer, we're going to use spoke 1. I'm going to use a dynamic allocation for the private IP addresses for the NATing that we're going to do. And let's go for the security piece. Remember, you are creating this private link service so other companies will consume the services behind your load balancer. In that way, the other companies also needs to be in Azure and also going to use a private endpoint on their side to connect to the private link service in your side. You need to define how you want to configure their permissions. You have role-based access control only. You can also restrict by subscription and then later add the different subscriptions that you want to approve. And you can also use anyone with your alias. But remember, you still need to approve it in order to be used by your customers. Let's just create the private link service. Once the deployment is complete, we can take a look at the resource itself. We're going to go to private link services and we don't have any connections for now so far. One of the things that we need to take is the alias, which is the one that we're going to use in a different subscription or a different tenant that I'm going to use to connect to that specific standard load balancer. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to change to a different subscription. Here we are in a different tenant, different subscription. There is nothing that these two different networks have in common. Now I'm going to create a private endpoint, as I was referring previously, into this other subscription, which is going to be the consumer side. I'm going to name it as private endpoint for private link service. That's a good name for it. And in this case, I'm going to use North Europe in this subscription because the machine that I have for these testing purposes is in that specific region. Differently from the private endpoint for storage account, I'm going to use the alias, and here's that I'm going to just paste it, the one that I just copied from the private link service, and probably I can use the request message to say, let me in. And then what I need to define is where my private endpoint is going to be, just like in previous demos. In this case, I only have one virtual network, and I'm just going to use that. I don't need the DNS integration here because this is not an Azure service, and we're just going to create a private endpoint. One of the things that I need to do after I created a private endpoint is that the private endpoint will generate a request to the private link service. I'm going to go back to the original subscription, and in here, we are going to see the request in a bit. What we're seeing now is the request with the let me in message, and now it is in pending state. What I need to do now, since I didn't use any other security methods, I need to approve it. Once I approve it, I'm just going to write OK, and I'm going to be able to use that private link service that has a standard load balancer behind it into the private endpoint that I just created in the other subscription. Let's go back to that other subscription. The deployment is complete, so we need to have that private IP. Remember that every private endpoint does have a network interface. What I'm going to do now, I'm just going to get the network interface for that private endpoint. I'm going to copy that into the clipboard. And one of the things that I have in my other network is a virtual machine. In this case, I'm only going to copy the local IP, And as you can see, now I'm getting into the standard load balancer. And I'm not using the public IP. I'm using the Microsoft Backbone Network to access that service that was published through the Private Link service. And with that, let's go back to the presentation. This concludes our session. Please review the following slide to remember some of the topics touched on this video. Pause the video now and read carefully some of the Azure Private Access solutions we reviewed today. There are many ways to continue your learning journey. We encourage you to watch other videos in this course or search out your next favorite topic on Microsoft Learn at aka.ms/learn.